I feel in my heart when I have the privilege of working and teaching the Word. I always endeavor to teach it like it's the last time I'll ever have the privilege of teaching it. But long before you teach it, you have to work it. And whenever I work the Word, I always feel that I'm in the greatness of all the greatness that's available in the world. That's how I feel when I work the Word. And so whenever I pick up that Word to work it, and I always feel like I'm in the presence of the greatness of all the greatness that God ever made available to people. And that's why I endeavor to show myself approved unto God as a workman who needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word. Furthermore, when I study the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I absolutely stand in utter amazement of what they don't say. That's what shakes me. What they don't say. That's why the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the works of editorial geniuses, or they are simply the works of holy men of God who wrote as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. There is no other alternative or no other explanation for the four Gospels. Jesus died in 28 A.D. And, of course, he arose 3 days later. 50 days later, he ascended. 10 days later, the day of Pentecost. So all this occurred in the year 28 A.D. Now, Matthew wrote his gospel at least 20 years after this occasion. The scholars say it was 48 years after, basically. I cut it way back because I want to teach you something. Most of the biblical scholars concur and believe that Matthew was written about 70 A.D. So if Jesus Christ died in, 28, that gives you 48 or whatever it is. What is it? Yeah, years later. Mark wrote his gospel at least 14 years after the resurrection. Most of the biblical men believe that he wrote his gospel around 60 A.D. Luke wrote his gospel at least 35 years after the resurrection, the ascension, and the day of Pentecost. And there most of the scholars believe it was written around 63. John wrote his gospel at least 50 years after the day of Pentecost. And the scholars, for the most part, say it was written between 90 and 110 A.D. Now these men, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all lived before the day of Pentecost and after They sort of lived in two administrations. All of these men had experienced the new birth. They were born again. All of these men spoke in tongues. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They all operated manifestations of the Spirit. All of these men, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, had all seen the great revival in Jerusalem that occurred on the day of Pentecost and afterwards. They'd all seen this. They'd been a part of it. They had seen the outreach into Antioch, the great moving of the word in Ephesus. All of those men knew the Pauline revelation. All of them. They knew the revelation of the mystery. They knew it. They heard it. All of that. Yet, class, there is not one word in all the four Gospels regarding the mystery. Mark was Paul's companion for years. Traveled with Paul. Well, what do you think he heard? Paul's teaching, right? Luke, the beloved physician, accompanied Paul for 18 years. In 18 years, you ought to know a little bit about something, about that individual and what he teaches, right? John was around all the time, even beyond the destruction of the temple, Herod's temple, by Titus in 70 A.D. All of these men, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were all knowledgeable of the mystery and everything Paul taught. And yet, there is not one word regarding the mystery in all the four Gospels. That is why I said to you, the Gospels have to be the works of editorial geniuses, or they have to simply be the words which holy men of God wrote as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. And to the advanced class tonight, I'd like to say, none of you perhaps will ever be able to fathom in your heart, because you didn't have the experience that I had, but one of the greatest days in my life was when I first saw and learned from the Scriptures that the four Gospels were Old Testament. Man, how I used to try to harmonize words in the Old Testament with words in the church epistles. Just slave away at it day after day after day. There is no man living that can put the church epistles into the Gospels or the Gospels into the church epistles. And so the day when I first saw and I learned that the four Gospels were Old Testament, what a wonderful day in my life that was. In Romans chapter 15, in verse 4, for whatsoever things were written, what? Aforetime, before the day of Pentecost, were written, F-O-R, for our what? not written to us, but written F-O-R, for our what? Learning. It was another one of those tricks of the adversary, deliberate forgeries to put the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, into the New Testament of our Bibles.